Hello, we're here for part two of our discussion of the for the unemployment notes. And what we did in the last video lecture was to talk about these two bullet points. And what we're going to be doing, excuse me, today is to thinking of, about this. So describing different types of unemployment or reasons why somebody might be unemployed, and then thinking about what the implications are for how we define the unemployment rate. And then in the final set of notes, we'll link this to a concept that's known as output gaps. So we talked about the measurement of unemployment in the last set of notes. What I want to do is think a little bit more conceptually about the nature of unemployment. And so, from a conceptual point of view, it's sometimes useful to think about somebody as being unemployed for one of several distinct reasons. So somebody would either be unemployed for frictional reasons, unemployed for structural reasons, or unemployed for cyclical reasons. And so, again, while we can't do this experiment, it would be what I'm envisioning here is akin to being able to ask everybody who was unemployed in the macroeconomy the reason for their unemployment, and then we would drop them into one of these three buckets. So what I want to do is think about them in turn. So for frictional unemployment, what we have in mind is unemployment that is relatively short-term in nature. It occurs because we cannot costlessly or instantaneously match workers and firms. The other aspect of this is that while we would, other things equal, like to have less unemployment in the macroeconomy than more unemployment, we also recognize that in a market-based economy, there's some degree of frictional unemployment is both inevitable because we can't, again, costlessly or instantaneously match workers and jobs, but it's also good in order to get the most efficient match. So workers and firms are evaluating the marginal benefit of making this employee-employer relationship against the marginal cost. So why might frictional unemployment arise? There are three reasons why we think about frictional unemployment arising. So why does it arise? One reason why we would expect to see frictional unemployment turns on the efficiency with which we can match workers and firms. So things that would influence this would be the mechanisms that we use for applicant screenings, the nature of job postings, informational interviews, online job boards, maybe the use of headhunter agencies or job placement services. As far as public policy is concerned, we think about public policy influencing the level of frictional unemployment to the extent that governments sponsor job fairs or job search centers or any other kind of programs that facilitate the matching of workers and firms. Other things equal, the greater the efficiency of these sorts of resources that match workers and firms, the lower is the level of frictional unemployment. Another reason why we might see frictional unemployment arising in the macroeconomy, again, we think about it as being relatively short-term unemployment, is because of a skills mismatch. And I want to be very clear that we think about this as being different or different from the category of unemployment that we're going to turn to next, which is structural unemployment, in that what we're describing here is not that the worker has a complete lack of skills, but rather the idea that technological change and international trade are going to lead to changes in the mix of industries and occupations in which jobs are available. And so it can take time for a worker, for instance, to realize that their own skills are not as much in demand and to seek retraining. So again, other things equal, we would like to have less unemployment than more unemployment. And so we might ask what kinds of public policy avenues are devoted to reducing frictional unemployment. And again, we would think about this as turning on the provision of information that better facilitates these matches. So information about required skills for jobs or areas of geographic need, and perhaps publicly funded retraining programs. And then the third reason why we think about relatively short term unemployment arising is because of unemployment insurance and other um income support policies that are yes, policies in place during unemployment spells. So, when we think about just benefits and costs and the opportunity cost principle, unemployment insurance reduces the opportunity cost of another day spent searching. So, if you know that you don't have to take the first job that comes along because of the fact that you have unemployment insurance, that which allows you to maintain to some degree your income level and your consumption path, then you'll take a little bit more time to search and to improve the efficiency of a match. And so, what I want to do at this point is to do two participation questions kind of in short order, mostly because I forgot to do the first one earlier. Um, oh, actually, I'm going to stick the first one earlier. So never mind. This will be participation question number two. So I want to think about different types of employment and unemployment in this context. The second reason why somebody might be unemployed is because they're unemployed for structural reasons. So if we think about the difference between frictional unemployment and structural unemployment, frictional unemployment again is relatively short term unemployment that's arising because of the reasons that we identified earlier, things like the efficiency of resources for matching, skills mismatch, and unemployment insurance. Structural unemployment is longer term and chronic unemployment that occurs, again, even when the economy is producing at its normal rate. It can arise for a variety of factors, and I have a list here that we're going to go through and comment upon. But another way to think about structural unemployment is that structural unemployment occurs because there simply aren't enough jobs for everyone who wants to work at the prevailing market wage. And so that last part is very key. It's at the prevailing market wage. So what I want to do is comment on some of the reasons that I have listed here for the existence of structural unemployment. So I have the skills and in industrial shifts, so here and here, coupled with worker immobility. So if you recall in the discussion of frictional unemployment, I said one of the reasons why there could be frictional unemployment is a skills mismatch. So what the authors of the textbook are trying to do is to draw a distinction between um, a skills mismatch that could be addressed through job training or just better information about what's required for a particular job, and a fundamental imbalance that exists. So, when we're thinking about structural unemployment on this dimension of skills and industry structural shifts, coupled with worker immobility. What I mean by this is that there are skills shifts and industrial restructuring that simply reduce the number of jobs that are a match for the skills and the experiences of some workers. So with frictional unemployment, it's not a relative shortage of jobs. It's that there's a temporary imbalance in the skills mix. For structural unemployment, again, the fundamental distinguishing factor is that we are talking about there simply not being enough jobs for everyone who wants to work at the prevailing minimum wage. So for job protection and regulations for this thing, I mean, it sort of sounds almost paradoxical that government regulations could be contributing to the problem of unemployment, but there are some sorts of regulations that involve job protection that make it harder, for instance, for a firm to fire workers. So for some of you who you may see this when you do your country analysis, that there are particular labor laws in place that require, for instance, somebody to work for a specified period of time before they could be dismissed, or there are rules where you just simply can't dismiss without having some extreme cause. So when we think about the adverse consequence of this is that workers know that in principle they could slack off and it's hard or harder to fire them. At the same time, employers are going to be much more cautious in hiring. They're going to search longer for a potential good match and potentially, and along with that, probably hire fewer workers. So therefore, taken together, we would see that the upside of these kinds of regulations is that indeed fewer people would lose their job, which would be the desired impact of these kinds of regulations, but also that this could contribute to a reduced demand for labor, which could do one of two things, not necessarily mutually exclusive. They could just this reduced demand for labor can depress wages, or it could increase structural unemployment because of wage rigidity. And this idea of wage rigidity is what I want to turn to next. So we'll turn to this, not strictly speaking next, but in the next kind of substantive part of our discussion. I also want to suggest that there are other reasons for structural unemployment, things like language barriers. So immigrants might face much more protracted periods of unemployment simply because of an inability to read or write the language of the country. There can be income related barriers to unemployment as well, things like transportation or difficulties with obtaining childcare or scheduling of hours. So when we think about St. Louis, for instance, in the metropolitan area, it's frequently the case that there are job openings, a lot, in some instances, a lot of them in the suburban St. Louis areas, the far-flung suburban St. Louis areas, but in the city, that's less true. But it's very difficult. Public transportation is not great in the city and county of St. Louis, and then continuing to the farther flung counties. And so it's often difficult for somebody who's living in the city, for instance, to get to where jobs are available. Similarly, for people who tend to be working hourly wage type jobs, frequently employers can do scheduling changes at the last minute, which makes it difficult to plan out how you're going to handle, say, childcare or again basic transportation problems. So these kinds of things that are very much driven by affluence or lack of affluence or out and out poverty are things that can contribute to structural unemployment. And then, of course, there's discrimination. So if people are acting in a discriminatory fashion, then there just simply aren't going to be jobs available for people who are available to work. What I want to turn to in the next several set of notes is to think about this issue of downward wage rigidity as being a contributor to the problem of unemployment generally and structural unemployment specifically. But in order to do that, what we need to do is to think, first of all, about describing the labor market. So that is what we're going to turn to after. After a participation question. So welcome back. What I want to do to get at this question or get at this idea that one of the things that can contribute to structural unemployment is downward nominal wage rigidity is to first of all characterize what we mean by the labor market. So we're in macroeconomics, so we're going to talk about the labor market as if there is just one. But of course, in real life, there's a whole bunch of micro labor markets that might be defined by geography or by job type or whatever. So we're going to kind of grossly oversimplify things here. When we think about the demand and the supply and the labor market, generally we have a picture that should be fairly familiar based on our earlier discussion. On the horizontal axis, we're going to have a quantity measure. So we might think about it as the quantity of workers, perhaps measured in numbers or hours. And on the vertical axis, we're going to have a price measure, which would be the nominal wage in, say, dollars per hour in the US. We have a downward sloping demand curve for labor. We think about the demand curve for labor being a derived demand, meaning that firms are going to demand labor because of the value of output that that labor can produce. So when I say for the value of goods and services produced, what I mean is labor is demanded because labor is used along with other inputs to produce goods and services that are available for sale in the marketplace. So firms' demand for labor is derived from the fact that labor is producing goods and services. The supply of labor is, of course, by us, by individuals, job seekers. What defines the supply of labor? Well, at some level, it's going to be a labor as we say in economics, a labor leisure trade off or a labor working for pay versus not working for pay trade off. So, these kinds of things, if you were particularly interested in these questions of labor economics and labor market dynamics, in the spring, there's a course called like Labor in the Economy or something like that, Econ 380, that's offered. And you spend the whole semester talking about really interesting things involving the demand and supply of labor, discrimination issues, wage determination, and lots more fun stuff. So that would be something to look into if you were particularly interested in that. What we're going to focus on is a little bit more simplistic here. We're going to recognize that when we have a demand and a supply of labor, the interaction of demand and supply are going to define an equilibrium. And so this maybe in light of what we're going to talk about later, we can think about this as a free market or a competitive market. So that is competitive. I'll actually write it out. A competitive market equilibrium, because we are going to talk about an equilibrium in the labor market that is different from this. So when we talked about an equilibrium before, we would talk about a price at which quantity demanded and quantity supplied are the same. So here, if we were going to identify, of course, that notion of the wage rate, we would say it's W star, where the quantity demanded and quantity supplied of labor are the same, which is L star. And what does that mean? Well, in this context, if the wage goes to W star, we have a situation in which quantity demanded of labor and quantity supplied of labor are the same, which is the same thing as saying every employer who wants to hire workers at this equilibrium wage can do so. And importantly, importantly, every worker who wants to work at this equilibrium wage can find a job. This sounds like full employment. So it's really tricky to think about in this context of the labor market. How do we think about the problem of unemployment? So we can ask ourselves, is it these people? Is it the people that, if we think about unemployment, is it the people who say, I observe that the W star wage, maybe is $7 per hour, but I would only be willing to work if the wage were 8, 9, 10, $15 per hour, and so therefore I'm not employed. Is that how we think about unemployment? And the answer is conventionally no. So, probably there are people who are unemployed because of just unrealistic expectations about wages. So, in other words, they can't kind of process that the equilibrium wage is, say, in this example, $7 per hour. But that doesn't empirically represent the majority of people who are unemployed. If we go to survey related data, what we see is that unemployed people, time and time again, are going to report that they can't quite figure out what's going on because they have friends or acquaintances who have similar skill levels who are employed, and these unemployed people would be willing to work at the jobs and the wages that are similar to those that are obtained by their friends or their acquaintances, but these employers of their friends and acquaintances don't seem to be hiring. So how do we square this? How do we make sense of this? And the way in which we're going to make sense of this is to draw a distinction between the market clearing wage. So this is what earlier I had as W star, or the competitive or free market competitive market wage would be another synonym for that. At that point, again, what we're defining is, at this L star, we have a situation in which the quantity demanded of labor and the quantity supplied of labor are the same. And by definition, there is no unemployment at that market clearing wage. So, in order to make sense of this, what we need to do is to suggest that sometimes what's happening is that the bargained wage gets stuck above the wage that would otherwise clear the labor market, or the one that we would think of as this W star. So suppose the bargained wage is at this level that's denoted by B here. In that particular case, what we can observe is we have a situation in which at the bargained wage, this is the quantity supplied of labor, right? So here is the quantity supplied of labor at the bargained wage. And from the demand curve, again, we remember that this would be the quantity demanded of labor, again, at that bargained wage. And we have a situation in which, of course, the quantity supplied is bigger than the quantity demanded. This is a surplus of labor at the bargained wage. And at that bargained wage, there is this gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And this is how we're thinking about structural unemployment. And so, in order to kind of make some sense of this, what we might then turn to is, why in the world would it be the case that a wage could be stuck above the market clearing wage? Why would we see producers and suppliers and demanders be okay with this higher than otherwise market clearing wage? There are several reasons that we might suggest. One reason is the phenomenon or the idea of efficiency wages. So in the textbook, there is the discussion of Henry Ford trying to reconcile the monotony of working on the assembly line in the Ford plants in the early 1900s with keeping that assembly line going and hitting on the idea that if he paid a wage that was vastly above the market wage, he could pick and choose among people who showed up, the most productive people, and keep his assembly line humming right along. Um, More to the point, I think about myself, both as a youngster when I was a babysitter, and also as a parent of young children when way back when, and I was employing babysitters. I was both the beneficiary of receiving what I think was largely above the bare minimum market clearing wage for babysitting services. But when I was a parent, man, when I wanted a babysitter, I wanted a babysitter. I needed to get out of the house. And so I got in the habit of paying to the best of my ability above what I thought was the market clearing wage. I actively asked around, what are you paying babysitters? And paid above it. And the idea there was to ensure that of the people that I would call, I could have a high probability that I was going to be able to get somebody to come when I wanted them to do some sitting for me. And then also they were very conscientious. Because they knew that I was paying higher than the going market wage. In the same sense, just more generally, when we think about efficiency wages, while yes, they cause structural unemployment, but again, almost paradoxically, they can lower total labor costs. Why is that? Well, it is because workers who are the recipients of the efficiency wage, the above market clearing wage, know that they're going to face a lower wage if they have to take another job someplace else. And so it encourages higher productivity from the perspective of the firm. If they've got more eager workers who are more inclined to stick with the job longer, it's going to lower their hiring and training costs of using labor. So that's what we mean by lowering total labor costs. In the development literature, both development economics and then more broadly, say in an IAS class, it wouldn't surprise me if you talked about this as well, that paying efficiency wages is viewed as a smart development strategy because it not only encourages productivity on the part of labor, but also it improves standards of living for the people who are employed. And so if the workers and their families have higher incomes, they're going to have better health and in a long run sense, be more productive. So we see this application or this idea of efficiency wages happening in a variety of different literatures. But the bottom line is an efficiency wage is one that is a higher wage, higher than what? Higher than the competitive market clearing wage in order to encourage greater productivity. There are some other reasons that are suggested for nominal wage rigidity, and one of these is the presence of unions. So unions can bargain to keep wages higher for some workers. This is in the United States going to be less of a driver of downward nominal wage rigidity. So maybe I should have put that in here. I'll write it in here now. So what prevents market wages from dropping to the market clearing level? Could be bargaining on the part of unions. Again, probably more compelling for countries other than the United States, where the influence of unions has waned over the years, but nonetheless, certainly an explanation. Minimum wage laws could also fall into this category. And again, I want to say could. Again, in the United States, there's lots and lots of research that is devoted to this basic question of, do minimum wages cause unemployment? And depending on how you slice and dice the data, I think a reasonably fair assessment of the literature is Yeah, it probably minimum wages probably do contribute to unemployment because they are by definition higher than the market clearing wage, but the extent of unemployment is not very large. And so if we had other societal objectives associated with paying minimum wages, then those might trump the sort of efficiency considerations that we're describing here. And then a third reason why we might see downward nominal wage rigidity, so in other words, why do we not see out and out cuts in nominal wages, turns on something that we had in the prior class, and that's or prior set of notes, and that's this idea of money illusion. So money illusion, of course, again, is the idea that we can be confused between nominal variables and their real counterparts. So we have a couple of propositions. One of these is that people hate it when employers cut their wages, um, and so I can certainly attest to that. Managers, employers know this, so even when business is struggling, managers will try to get by without cutting wages. So money illusion can lead workers, not savvy ones, but some workers, to feel like they're okay because their nominal wage isn't being cut. But again, that's a nominal wage. If there's inflation, real wages are falling. But what you can see here is that this is a chart that I believe was in chapter 12, that when we look at just the behavior, the pattern of wages, we see that out and out cuts in nominal wages are relatively rare. And what happens to annual changes in nominal wages is that they tend to center on zero. Or if you think about this, this is one, two, and three, maybe 4% increase. And in a world in which the rate of inflation is 2%, around 2% or a little bit less, again, what this is saying is that nominal wages are either the overwhelming majority of nominal wages are either not rising at all or they're rising just to keep up with the rate of inflation. And so this idea that employers can somehow, maybe fool people by not cutting nominal wages is going to be another thing that's going to contribute to nominal wage rigidity. What I want to turn to at this point now is, in this context, thinking about our third characterization of why people might be unemployed. And this is because of cyclical reasons. So, frictional reasons, very short term matching of people to jobs, structural reasons, something that is endemic, that prevents there from being enough jobs for everyone who wants to work at the prevailing market wage, where that prevailing market wage could be stuck above the one that would clear the market, as I have in this picture. And then cyclical unemployment is the unemployment that arises as a result of downturns in the economy. So let me go back. So here we have our basic picture that we had before, essentially. So we've got our normal demand for labor, meaning when the economy is behaving sort of normally, more or less, as we'll describe it subsequently, at full employment. We've got a supply curve of labor. The market clearing wage would be this W star and L star quantity of labor. And we're going to suppose that there is for whatever reason, whether it's minimum wages, efficiency wages, money illusion, for whatever reason, the nominal wage is stuck above the one that would otherwise clear the market. Then, of course, we observe that there is structural unemployment in the macroeconomy. Now, let's suppose that there's a recession. Well, we said that the demand for labor is derived because of labor's ability to, with other inputs, produce goods and services that are for sale. If there is a reduced demand for output, then there's going to be a reduced demand for labor. So let's suppose that the demand for labor falls to this one that I have in red, the lower labor demand due to recession. What happens? Well, again, if the wage can't clear the market, then we're going to see additional unemployment that's arising for cyclical reasons. So, in other words, at this bargained wage and the new labor demand curve, at this one that's in purple, this defines the quantity demanded of labor. So the quantity demanded of labor is going to drop by this additional amount that we would attribute to cyclical reasons. And so therefore, then the overall level of unemployment is going to rise. We have the amount that's attributable to structural problems that we identified earlier simply because the nominal wage can't drop for whatever reason to the one that would clear the labor market. Plus, we have this additional, cyclical unemployment. And so then the net effect is that the level of unemployment rises. So it was formerly this amount that was in blue. Now we're adding in this cyclical component as well. So when we think about cyclical unemployment, we can think about it as coming about because the demand for labor is fluctuating and the wage in the market cannot adjust sufficiently to balance the quantity demanded and quantity supplied of labor. So what we're going to do is kind of pause for a moment for a third participation question and then return for a summary. So where are we? We have identified that there are three types of unemployment. So again, if we could line up or gather everybody who is unemployed into a masked and socially distant group and ask them why is a person unemployed, they would give reasons that would, in an ideal world, uniquely put them into the bucket of frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, or cyclical unemployment. Frictional unemployment is going to occur when there are enough jobs, but it takes some time for people and workers to find each other. Structural unemployment, again, is going to occur when there are not enough jobs for everyone at the prevailing wage. And so, in other words, the wage is prevented from falling for whatever reason to the one that would clear the market. Frictional and structural unemployment together will explain why the equilibrium unemployment rate is above zero. So, this is important. The authors are referring to this non zero unemployment rate as the equilibrium unemployment rate. And we think about this as being the long run, say, equilibrium unemployment rate. It's going to be the rate of unemployment that persists even when, as we'll describe in the final set of notes, we think about the economy behaving normally. So, in a normal market based economy, there will always be some frictional unemployment, there will always be some structural unemployment. So, it is an equilibrium, but again, it's important for you to remember that we're not describing this as an equilibrium outcome in the way that we talked about it for in our market clearing sense. When we think about cyclical unemployment, this is the extra unemployment that occurs during periods of recession. And again, due to, say, leftward shifts in the demand for labor, and in all likelihood, compounded by the fact that nominal wages can't drop far enough to clear the labor market. And again, for perhaps one of many reasons. So, what is total unemployment? Total unemployment is going to be the sum of frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment. And the key idea again here, and the thing that we'll turn to in the next set of notes in the final for this broad category unemployment, is that unlike cyclical unemployment, which is going to be present only during recessions where the demand for labor has turned down, frictional and structural unemployment are always present in the economy, even when it is operating normally. And so, with that, we'll conclude, and there'll be one more set of notes that we will turn to in the next video.